Good evening, everyone. Today we have with us Mr. Debottam Bose. And so the way the session will work is I'll give a brief introduction of him and his practice, and we'll be engaging in a moderated Q&A, post which we'll open up the session for the audience. Thank you so much, Debottam, for being here, and thank you so much, Gauri, for being here as well. And we hope to have a very, very engaging session with you.
Thank you, Satyajit. Very happy to be here.
Thank you. Debottam T. Bose is India's first art lawyer. He's a senior legal advisor to the Oxford India Centre, Somerville College, Oxford University, and on the legal committee of the J.N. Tata Endowment Fund. And he's a global ambassador for Indiaspora, USA. Debottam is based in London and has an international art and philanthropy practice, covering UK, USA, UAE, India, and Singapore. Debottam guest lectures frequently and has taught at the Harvard Law School, Harvard Business School, Columbia University, and National University of Singapore. He divides his time between London, New York, Oxford, Paris, Dubai, New Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta, and Singapore. Thank you so much for being here. And let me just begin by saying that I had actually attended one of your sessions in Bombay back when I was just about beginning, or I'd just sort of, gotten done with college. And you were one of the most kindest people who had sort of, engaged with me and given me a lot of interesting pieces of advice for something on fakes and forgeries that I was working on. I'm sure you would not be recollecting me, but you've been a very, very kind help, Debottam. Thank you so much for that.
That's extremely thoughtful and very kind of you to say so. Thank you.
To begin with, we hear of this word provenance quite often in the art world, Debottam. Can you shed some light on what provenance means and what are the legal and illegal implications of the same?
Sure. And you're absolutely right. It's really quite a recent phenomena that we hear these words. And I call them the 3 Ps. So provenance, published, and pitfalls. And they kind of go hand in hand. So to answer your question, provenance is really, it's a link between the artist and every time that the work has exchanged hands, and not necessarily over a sale. It can be a gift. Late M.F. Hussain, he was an extremely generous artist, and he would gift his artworks to so many different people. So when, for example, if he's gifting it to a person, a friend, that becomes the person who has that work. The provenance means that it came from the artist to this person. Now, this person's family member may want to sell it, and certainly sell it at a commercial value. And once that happens, then the chain of ownership gets documented. And that's what provenance really means. It links it back to the creator, the artist in this context. So Gauri, do you want to add something else to that?
I think you covered most of it, sir. Provenance loosely translate to getting to know the train of from where the art comes from and where it's been to where it goes. Now, to where it goes, it becomes very important to know where it came from. Since we're dealing with a market full of fakes, forgeries, and especially of some of the most greatest artists' work, a preliminary glance of looking at the brushstroke, looking at the signature of the artist doesn't cut it. This is why we call art law as being more investigative in nature, wherein I have seen Debottam sir look through a painting, not only look at the brushstrokes, see the signatures, and then go on to trace as to from where the painting has come from, directly from the artist, and where it's been or where it's gone.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gauri.
You brought up a very interesting point, Gauri, a point about, fakes and forgeries. And of course, there are so many questions around authenticity. There are so many questions around provenance, intellectual property rights, and stuff like that. I remember in your session that you'd taken at the CSMVS in Bombay, back from when I had the privilege to engage with you for the first time, you would also mention that there are times that the work might be original, but the provenance might be a forged provenance, so to say. Right, the paperwork might have been forged or something of that sort. When there are so many different kinds of situations and probabilities and possibilities that exist, are there any legal frameworks or regulations that a collector could be aware of that might protect them? Any international regulation or national regulation or something of that sort?
You see, what happens is art is it's a private market, right? So when you talk about regulation, that is a different world. But that said, so the art world is incredibly profitable market commercially. It's valued over $60 billion a year. That's a staggering amount of money, and it's only growing as people become wealthy. They are collecting art, and some also are collecting art as an investment. Now, that's when it becomes a little bit more tricky because that's when these three P's, which I mentioned, provenance, published, and pitfalls, become relevant. So in our chambers, we operate where we are instructed when a collector is looking to buy an expensive piece of work, or for that matter, when a collector who has collected over decades, they may not have all the paperwork because, 20, 30 years ago, this just wasn't prevalent. And they knew the artist would probably come to their home, they would be best of friends, or even they would be mentors to the artist. I know of people like that. So they may not have those documentation. So then our job as art lawyers would be to sit with the collector and establish that provenance. And equally, when we are instructed to go and look for the artwork, what we in legal parlance, it's called due diligence. So, we establish, but before establishing, we, as Gauri was mentioning, that it's investigative in nature. So we look at whatever paperwork that they have. Just to give you an example, I always believe in giving examples. We recently acted for quite a well-known, and since it's a World Cup, I thought I'll bring it up. I can't mention the name because it's confidential. A very well-known cricketer, an Indian cricketer, who really didn't know anything about art. So we were very surprised. Our client instructed us, and he was selling quite a lot of artwork, and it had named art pieces, including Hussein works. There was fantastic works of art. They looked beautiful, and we have our experts, and we brought them in, and when we looked at the work, they were also, they said they are stunning works, but that's 50% of the due diligence. The other half is to establish this provenance. So where did this very famous personality get the artworks? And it's simply not good enough to say that Hussein was a good friend of mine or a good friend of my family. That's just not enough, simply because the works of art are so expensive. Today, if you were buying something for 10,000 rupees or 5,000 rupees, you wouldn't bat an eyelid. But if today you're buying it in crores, that's a fortune. I mean, you can buy a house for that money. Then I think the question, and we have to answer, how do you tie it to the artist? What evidence do you have? You may not have any paperwork, but would there be any photographs with the artist, with the artwork? And these are very relevant, because, again, we worked on a transaction where we had the particular agent of the seller who had a picture of the artwork with the artist. But that was faked, because when we took a closer look at that picture, and we took a look at the finger which was holding the painting, you could see that it was airbrushed. So yes, to answer your question. Corey, did you want to add anything else?
Exploring the law part of art becomes important, especially in a country where art law itself doesn't have any legislation. So you go looking bits and pieces in every other legislation that governs it, just so you're secure. So you look at Contract Act, you look at the IP regime, you look at your procedural laws. Because tomorrow, if I end up in a dispute, I'll be taking a look at each of these to address what my remedies are. The Tapat and Art Treasures Act, which touches upon the artists that are the 9 national treasures.
Gauri, can you
So,
please repeat yourself? Your voice is cracking up, and I think probably it might be an issue with the internet connection. If you can please repeat yourself.
sure, sir.
Thank you.
So, as I was addressing, law part of art law doesn't come from one umbrella legislation. Unfortunately, India does not have any one law that governs the sale of art law. Rather, we have laws in different parts, such as the Indian Contract Act. Then you have the IP law regime coming in, and the procedural laws in place, and your punitive law, which covers what happens in a situation if a fake or a fake. Since what you're looking to make good of is the amount of money that you suffered the loss. And in case it's a reputational damage, those are additional damages that you can see. Now, this apart, you also have certain international conventions through which India has made its own set of laws, which are the Antiquities and Art Treasures Act, and with this said act. Now, this only covers few of the art. That's the 9 national treasures. Now, these include very well-known artists such as Amrita Sher, and then you have Rabindranath Tagore, and few of the artists that are known to India as their own artists. Unfortunately, India being such a huge art exporting country lacks strength in its laws to ensure that a fair trade is happening with the exports. So we go back and touch upon different legislations in place. And where an art lawyer becomes important here is to look at the mode of how you want to go about if a fake or a forgery is sold to you in the future. So our chambers focuses on arbitration and mediation as a form of dispute resolution rather than take your traditional means of litigation, which might drag on for a few years, and your expenditure for such litigation also skyrockets. So what is preferred right now in the new world and what is most cost effective is arbitration and mediation, which is something we as art lawyers push for, especially in today's market, considering how volatile investing in art is and also considering how cost effective it is.
Thanks, Gauri, for that. And the other benefit of using ADR, alternative dispute resolution, is that the art business is a relationship business. People who are buying art, collectors, they may have known each other for quite some time. Some of them may have even inherited works of art, not knowing that they may not be genuine. So you don't want to burn any bridges. And that's why using mediation or arbitration or conciliation, safeguards those relationships. And as Gauri mentioned, it's time bound. And most importantly, it's cost effective. So that becomes very relevant especially in today's world when, going to court is really the last resort, and extremely time consuming and not to mention very expensive. Thanks.
You mentioned that going to court is a very, very expensive affair. And of course, but what are the ways or what are the manners in which, a collector who is making a purchase, right? What are the due diligence steps that he or she could take, on their own, like some basic things, if they could maybe look out for before making a purchase, to maybe understand provenance, to maybe understand fakes and forgeries? Are there any specific people that they should be consulting in terms of maybe specialists or something of that sort, even before it goes to maybe an art lawyer or something of that sort? Is that a possibility?
Absolutely, Satya. That's a very good question. I always suggest the first thing that any person who's looking to buy art is that you go and look at the work. It's very important to spend a little time with the art piece, or send your agent, or send your friends or families, whoever, to actually, for a better user word, inspect the work of art. That's very important. The second thing is, yes, in terms of if it is an expensive work of art, it's important to get the professionals. And when I mean professionals, people who are independent. One of the things that happens a lot as well is vested interest and conflict of interest. And a lot of people give opinions without accountability. So very easy for people to dismiss a work of art saying, oh, it's not right, or it doesn't look right to me, or it's not really from a strong period. One must really understand one thing when it comes to collecting art. It's like food, okay? You don't have to understand art, you just have to like it. It's very personal. You may have a strong opinion about Hussein or Hussein's horses, or for that matter, the Mother Teresa series, but that's your opinion. Now, are you an authority on Amrita Shergill? I'm sorry, you're not. Okay. Are you independently giving an opinion? I'm sorry, you're not. So I think these are very important questions that one should ask if they start asking people who are not connected, who are not independent, and certainly they do not have, they have vested interest. In that sense, as I said, looking at the work is very important. Spending some time with the sellers, the parties, the gallerists, the dealers, whoever it may be. Just to give you another example, we were instructed for a sale between the US, Chicago, and New Delhi. And these were beautiful works of Manjit Bawa and Souza and Ram Kumar. And the client had not visited India to see these works of art. So I flew in, we got to see the work. And when we looked at the paperwork, there was a question mark because it said a company was selling these works of art. Now, as art lawyers, we have to ask the question, again, going back to, well, who are the owners? I understand legally a company can own works of art, but I would like to understand who the directors are, or if there is a holding company who, I mean, I'm getting a little bit in terms of corporate jargon, but the bottom line is who are the individuals, not legal persons. And it turned out to be that these were coming from the Malvinder Singh collection, Ranbaxy, where we had judgments from the Delhi High Court, Supreme Court of India, where they were not allowed to sell these works of art, right? Now, without going into too much of detail, that happens a lot. So it is very important that when people are buying works of art, which are expensive, as I said, if today it was a 5,000 rupees purchase, none of this really matters. But now artworks are very expensive, and some of them buy as investments, and they do appreciate, just like they're considered an alternative asset class, just like buying a property. So I think it's important to spend a little time getting to know the art piece, speaking to the advisors. They are very knowledgeable, who are actually connected with the piece to understand that. And equally, not to speak to too many people, because then the pitfall comes in, which is, people speaking out of turn where they have no business. Anything else, Gauri, you want to add to?
Just to one of Bangalore regarding sale of an art piece. Now, this was a Raja Ravi Verma, which was Jatayu Vardhana, wherein the Ravana holding Sita, trying to trying to kidnap her, and Jatayu coming into a kind of fight of Ravana. Now, this art piece becomes very significant because what was known back then was that there were only two existing art pieces that were made during this similar time period by Raja Ravi Verma, depicting this scene from history. So, when this said piece of art was sold to one of the companies that wanted to buy this from Bid and Hammer, one of the auction houses that is there in Bangalore. What became a question after part payment for the art piece was done was whether this was an original in the first place or not. Now, although it came with its own letter of authentication and provenance, what became a problem for the company was that they believed it was a fake, going by a random advice that they had gotten. Now, this became a lawsuit which later got an arbitrator involved. And it turned into an arbitration where, at the end of the day, the judgment read that it was not a fake. And although what was only known was that there were two paintings, this turned out to be the third. Now, when the art piece was sold itself, there were a lot of assurances given, and even independent experts looked at who confirmed that the said art piece was an original. However, as Sir mentioned, since a lot of people were listened to after part payment was done, a doubt regarding it being a fake or not arose. Now, again, that became a costly affair in itself. So, what becomes important is to look at the provenance, and next to that is to trust a source that's well known in the field.
Thanks, Gauri.
So this is an interesting case because once the part payment is done, it is at that point, the whole question and the whole issue arose essentially. Are there any, in your opinion, are there any legal contracts or agreements that a collector could get in while making a purchase or a sale or, while consigning works? And if so, what do these contracts, or what could these contracts typically address?
So again, this is an area when one is looking to buy a high value piece. I would strongly advise them to get independent counsel, advice from art lawyers, and when necessary, they would draft, those what they call reps and warranties, etc. But actually, the main thing really is the source, as Gauri mentioned. The credibility of the parties, that's equally important. And where we have acted on numerous transactions where, if there isn't any confidence, notwithstanding the contracts, because of the relationships and the good offices of ours were involved, we have returned the work of art, and taken the payment back. Because, as I said, when you are going down the alternative dispute resolution mode, the conversation, the communications are far more open. There, that does make a big difference. So again, I don't want to go into specific terms and contracts because that's a little bit beyond the scope. Works of art, or they're looking to consign works of art. Artists, we work a lot with artists when they're looking for international shows, and yes, we have to assist them with certain clauses. Equally with gallerists, there are a lot of negotiation that happens. Consignments, we worked with a number of artists where their works were put up in the new Bangalore airport.
Is it my connection?
there were certain terms
Satyajit,
which were not fair. Work on those.
We lost you there, Debottam. We lost you right at Bangalore Airport.
Sorry. So yes, as I was saying, so we would work with a number of artists whose works were commissioned by the airport, and there were certain clauses that we had to redraft. So those things come more specific when we are working. So my advice would be to, when they are going through it, certainly consult.
All right.
Gauri, would you like to add something else to it?
As Sir already pointed out, specific parties that are
Your voice is breaking again, Gauri.
Is this better? Okay. So as Sir pointed out, each deal and each contract is separate. There cannot be one general contract that could address any kind of sale of art that happens. Since what you're looking at is meeting the interests and mind of both the parties that are drawing up this agreement in the first place. And what we push for as art lawyers is to clauses which would benefit our own client. And this also includes adding clauses for alternative dispute resolution, such as the importance of an arbitration clause, and pointing out what could happen in case we as parties have a dispute at the end of it. So as Sir said, there cannot be one general contract, but it needs to be tailor-made for each of the art piece sold between each of the pieces.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gauri.
I remember. So this Ranbaxy case, and also I remember I'm not able to recollect the exact case. But again, at your session at the CSMVS, you'd spoken of there were common title and ownership issues in some of the case that one or two of the cases that you dealt with. Is that something that is a frequent? Is that something that is a frequent happening where there are title and ownership issues and challenges, and there isn't a clear-cut understanding of the ownership of a particular work, say for instance in terms of family disputes or something of that sort. So in such a scenario, is arbitration the only way to sort of resolve the conflict, or are there some other ways to do
it? That happens a lot. It happens in context of so when husband, wife, or family, they would have a lot of artwork, and of course we all know the Mafatlal case that got extremely complicated. But on generally speaking, so we always go down mediation first. Equally, what happens, and we haven't discussed so much on stolen works of art. So what happens is you would have a genuine piece of work, but what we call in the industry orphan works. So we would have, let's say, we worked on a Shergill where it was a genuine Shergill. We had got Vivan at that time, and it was genuine. The whole provenance, the letters were all doctored. And it was, and when we did our due diligence, we came blank. And they used, again, sadly, a renowned artist who was no longer alive called Paritosh Sen, and they had forged his letter, and on his letterhead they had written and created this false provenance. And what that allows is that a work without a provenance, a very, very different price tag compared to a genuine work with a full provenance. So in the art world, people are aware of that, and they take advantage of this. And for unsuspecting buyers who, going back to my three perils, 3Ps, provenance, publication, and the peril is if you're just ticking the box and not going behind the provenance, then essentially you're opening yourself to problems later on, which, for instance, in the context of the Ranbaxy was, if they had bought the works, ED would certainly be getting after and getting those artworks back. And in the context of the Shergill, if a person with a better title, which means that the true owner of the work can turn up, and imagine the embarrassment when you're throwing, well, it's Diwali's coming up, and imagine you brought this amazing Amrita Shergill and you're showing it off to your friends, and lo and behold, somebody comes and says, hang on, this, I've seen this work before. This used to hang in my great aunt's home. And if they have a better title, the law will recognize them as the legal title holder. And going back to slightly on an international level, I mean, I say this, that's how the whole Klimt case came to the international forefront, where if people get a chance, watch the movie Woman in Gold, Marion Altman, who was in Vienna and looking at these beautiful works of art by Klimt, particularly The Kiss. And then she recognized the subject matter, who happened to be her aunt, Adele Rockenbauer. And then she said, well, I remember as a kid, Klimt would come to their house and she would pose. And these certainly are private properties. And this, of course, was all stolen Jewish works of art from the Nazi era. And then we have a whole, Ralph Lauder then financed the whole thing, and the art world, Eric Kaufman, he handled the whole case. So coming back to, so these works of art, if it doesn't have title, then you are at a risk. If they are certainly, works of art which are forged, then there is no value to it. That's basically the scenario. Gauri, if you would like to add anything.
Coming back to the relevancy or the rampant fakes and forgeries that Sir pointed out right now, we have this happening internationally and nationally. And the tragedies of this is that it's gotten so good. The fakes and the duplicates have gotten so good that it becomes really tough to tell one thing apart from the other by any normal curator or somebody who's investing in art for the first time. Because in any of those cases, what you will look at is a very preliminary glance of the painting, apart from what the artistic style used is, or if the signature of the artist is there or not. These are important, however, they are still preliminary. So you go back to the professionals in this field to see letters of provenance and letters of authentication. And unfortunately, it doesn't stop there too. Because the role you take on and the responsibility you take on is at such a high stake, your investigation needs to be that good. So in most of these cases, it would include going back to the artist's family or people known to them and tracing out a line as to where these artworks came from. Raza famously told, he attended one of the exhibitions of his own works, and he famously told that 20 of these art pieces are fake. And this is coming from an artist who was living at that time of point and who saw his collections being faked and duped. Also talking about the most famous case of the Modigliani's fakes and forgeries that went around in the Italian market. This was a shock that came to the world, to any collector or artist who saw it. 20 of the pieces were duplicated and forged. So it becomes very important in this time and age, if one is investing in art and spending that much amount of money, to seek out professional help as and when they can.
Thank you for that. Again, since as you mentioned, cases
Sorry.
are on the rise, there are these really, really complex scenarios when it comes to, the kinds and the variety of fakes and forgeries that one comes across. Are there any common types of fakes and forgeries that are encountered that a collector could just be aware of, so that that little bit of information that they have before making a purchase, or just to keep in mind before making a purchase?
So, Satyajit, the rule of thumb is dead artists. Artworks where artist is no longer alive, you can be rest assured that there's going to be a very high chance it's going to be faked, unless you know the source. I mean, just now I assisted a very esteemed lawyer client who had bought, from back in the days, from a very reputed source. So that's great. But sadly, that's not the case in most of the times. Last time I was in India, I had to assist a client who was acquiring, again, Hussein Works, and this came from a very strong name in terms of family and who stood by their work. But when we did the research, we found out that the current owner knew nothing about art. He had zero interest. And because he was a very powerful and important person, he would get these artworks as gifts. And so he had no clue. All he knew that they were valuable. So later on, he just wanted to sell them and cash out. And he sold them to my client who was in New York. And then when my client later on wanted to put them in an auction house, question mark came up, and that's when we got involved and we started mediation. And that's when we did the due diligence. We found out that, well, the person who had so-called had a strong reputation, but nothing to do with in the art space. He had no idea about art collecting. He just got a lot of gifts. So the dealers in question just took it for granted that, oh, it has to be, from a sanguine source. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Thankfully, we were able to sort it all out. And again, thanks to mediation. But that happens a lot. And again, as I said, dead artists, artworks which are very valuable. You can be rest assured. Because it's the people are buying the same thing, sadly. It's art is also very aspirational in nature. And the pandemic has taught us, every time you're doing on a Zoom, or all these lawyers are doing Zoom calls, behind them is a Hussein or a Raza or a Manjit Bawa. So then the next person who really doesn't know much about art wants to buy that. And they also want a great price for it. And that is a disaster. A dead artist and a great price. That is a recipe for a fake work. So that's what my take is. Gauri, if you wanted to add something.
God is very right in saying this. The greatest artists are always the ones whose fakes and the duplicates are the most of. I think the most common who fall for this is any Van Gogh piece of art, or anything that's commonly known also becomes commonly fake. So
All right.
Thanks.
And my last question to you, what's your favorite art law case? You've spoken so much of it. You've worked on so many. Any personal favorite case that you worked on yourself, or any other case that you really admire? And
I mean, honestly, the art world is all about the people. And I always like to quote this. There's no such thing as art, but artists. And this is a famous quote by Gombrich, who it's in the first paragraph on the history of art. And for me, in my career, that has been so relevant because I have got to meet the most interesting, fascinating people. And they have collected art over decades, 4, 5, 6 decades. And most of the time it's like their children and grandchildren. And then also they have this, Zen quality about them, or a Jain quality when they say, I've had this, now I want it to go to another home. Let another young, collector enjoy these works of art. So when we are in the process of making that happen as seamlessly as possible, making sure that they are genuine, or if there are any disconnects, we kind of clear them. So that becomes truly a very rewarding experience. And of course, you have very complicated experiences where you're assisting people who are not very much knowledgeable about artwork, and then they listen to people give opinions. Oh, it's not a genuine work, and then you have to unravel those deals as well. So that's part of the job. And then, of course, art transactions are very international in nature. We can have a client in London, we can have a buyer in New York, or a seller in New Delhi, and we have to make it all work. Or for that matter, with gallerists, who are now representing Indian artists internationally, whether it at Frieze, whether it at Basel, and Basel has a number of different places, and when there is transactions happening, and also putting a strategy behind. Art law is very much about the strategy, assist the works of art. Ultimately, it's a relationship economy, getting to know the right curators, getting to know the right patrons, supporting foundations, so that young collectors get to meet the artists themselves. They get to support their works of art, and also, more importantly, get them into important pieces, into collections internationally. That really does make a huge difference in terms of recognition for the artist, and we have to work on all those. So I think those are very, very rewarding and enriching experiences as art attorneys. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Debottam. Thank you so much, Gauri. This has been a great, great session. I'd now like to open up the Q&A for the audience. If you have any questions, please go ahead.
I'll just go ahead with my first question. So Debottam, going ahead, of course, we are talking about the dead artists and works of dead artists, but how does the art world or the art industry at large going ahead with the help of technology for the years follow, the decades that are going to follow? Do you think blockchain, purely by it being non-biased and not controlled by anyone, can be an answer to a better provenance or a chain in that sense of ownership?
I mean, yes, academically speaking, there's a lot of thoughts that people have put forward for the merits of using blockchain, and absolutely. But we also have to look into the functionality and the transaction cost behind this. So, for example, I worked with a number of collectors and their dealers in US, and they exactly wanted to use blockchain to when it came to provenance and establishing every single information. And that's great on paper, but the transaction cost associated with that is quite expensive. So theoretically, yes, going forward, whether that is possible, that is feasible, it's absolutely doable. There's no question about that. And that information stays forever, and you can't tamper with it. So, that's exactly what is required. But whether it's feasible from the point of view of transaction costs, and also, don't forget, the energy cost behind it. I'm not sure right now, but we'll see. It's exciting.
Great.
May I ask a question?
Please go ahead, Mr. Mehta.
My question is very simple. I know most of the presentation has rightly been looking at purchasers, but in the Indian art market, where you're looking at sellers, sellers sometimes are quite fortunate to have got to know the artist and bought from the artist, and then the artist has died. And in that situation, the paperwork may not be as ideal as if the person had bought from a gallery. So in that sort of situation, what protection can the seller have in terms of trying to prove provenance?
Thanks for that question, Nikhil. So you're absolutely right. And as I had mentioned, that I have handled a number of collectors where they have collected art for the last 50 or 60 years, and they would have known the artist. They would have probably even mentored these artists and played a very important role in their success. And there weren't any paperwork at that time, certainly. And that's where the credibility of the seller makes all the difference. And I've assisted. I can't take their names, but they didn't have any paperwork. But the history of that person collecting art over the years, the anecdotes, the stories, those are very powerful provenance, and they're credible. And also, and I have arranged for what we call open houses, where this particular collector, she collected art, over 5 decades, and it was from all over. And I invited a number of young collectors who came, saw the artworks, and got to meet the collector, and who shared these very rich stories. And that was absolutely enough. And that's where the credibility of the source is, the integrity of the person, and the knowledge of the person. And this is it's a true story. So there you can't fault it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your question.